When Marcus Liu appeared at the door of a small emergency room in Ellsworth in September 2021, he was barely recognizable. Barefoot with bruised feet, his body nothing but skin and bones, draped in a tattered piece of fabric that was impossible to tell whether it was clothing or a makeshift covering. He was the exchange student who had gone missing 7 years earlier, along with his companion, in what was considered one of the safest areas of Acadia, a place where both had long been presumed dead by most people. But the most terrifying thing was not his appearance. The most terrifying thing was what he said about those 7 years, about the place where he had been held, about what had happened to Elena, and about the entities that seemed to still exist somewhere deep within the Acadia forest. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On September 13, 2014, at 7:40 a.m., 2 exchange students, Elena 19 and Marcus Liu, 20, left the dormitory of the University of New England in Bar Harbor to begin a day trip to Acadia National Park. According to Elena's roommate, who saw them in the dorm hallway that morning, both looked very cheerful and had prepared quite thoroughly for their plan to explore Ocean Path, carrying light backpacks, thin jackets, and a camera that Marcus often used for research assignments. Their goal for the day was the coastal area from Sand Beach to Thunder Hole, a famous trail section with granite terrain, steep cliffs, and observation points right at the water's edge, attracting visitors, especially during high tide. Elena and Marcus got into the school-rented sedan, double-checked their paper map and navigation gear, then drove along Park Loop Road toward the central area of the park. This was the last time friends in the school saw them at the dormitory. According to the schedule, Elena noted in her planner, the trip would not last more than 6 hours, and they planned to return around 4 or 5 p.m. to prepare for the department's group discussion. At 10:12 a.m., a traffic camera at the park entrance recorded their vehicle passing through, and nearly 20 minutes later, a visitor at the Sand Beach area confirmed seeing a young man and woman matching the description standing at a small turnoff, leading to a less traveled section of Ocean Path. That was the final confirmed trace of their activity that day. After this point, no further data came from either's GPS or phones, an initial non-issue since Acadia's coastal terrain has many miles-long stretches with no cell service. The alarm only truly sounded at 6 p.m. when Elena and Marcus still hadn't returned to the dorm. Their phones rang once, then went to voicemail, with no messages or updates sent. Feeling uneasy, school representatives didn't wait for formal procedures and immediately contacted the Bar Harbor Police Department to report the loss of contact and request urgent search assistance. Right after receiving the missing persons report, Acadia's search and rescue forces, in coordination with park rangers, began establishing a last known point based on 2 verified pieces of data: the image of Elena and Marcus's vehicle passing the entrance gate at 10:12 a.m., and the witness who saw them at the small turnoff near Sand Beach. This area was marked as the center of the initial search radius. By 7:30 p.m., the main SAR team was deployed with support from local rangers, 2 K9 units, and a drone team equipped with infrared cameras, aiming to sweep the entire coastal stretch from Sand Beach to Thunder Hole, under rapidly fading light and thickening sea fog. A grid search map was established with an approximate 2 kilometers radius around the LKP, divided into sections according to terrain: granite shorelines by the water, low scrub, lesser-used side trails, and steep cliff areas facing the Atlantic. Rangers focused on sweeping spots prone to slips and falls, while K9 teams were sent into interspersed wooded patches to search for scent. The drone flew along the trail, scanning heat signatures section by section to detect any human body signs within visible range. During the first 3 hours, the search team noted some natural traces: rocks displaced by large waves, branches broken by wind, faint skid marks on stone, possibly formed randomly from salt spray, but nothing directly linked to the missing person's behavior. No personal items were found, no clothing fragments, no dropped objects along the trail, and no long skid marks or signs of struggle, indicating a specific accident. The report concluding the first search phase stated that within the area adjacent to the last known point, there was no clear evidence suggesting Elena and Marcus had suddenly left the trail or encountered an easily identifiable incident within observable range, forcing search forces to reevaluate strategy and prepare to expand beyond the central ocean path area. On the morning of the third day since Elena and Marcus were last seen on Ocean Path, Acadia's search command decided to expand the sweep radius to 7 kilometers from the last known point after determining the central area had been nearly exhaustively covered with still no relevant signs. This expansion included the entire coastal section from Otter Cliff to Great Head, connecting side trails to Gorham Mountain Trail, high granite slopes where strong winds could carry away cries for help, and narrow rock crevices that could preserve traces longer. The SR team was divided into specialized groups, one mountaineering team using safety ropes to access sheer rock faces, another pushing deep into dense pine forest bands above Ocean Path, where old, little-used trails existed, and the remaining group assigned to scour the rocky shoreline at low tide for the possibility the students had accidentally been swept into heavy surf zones. Drone data in this phase was enhanced with longer-range flights, scanning mountain slopes in a zigzag pattern to miss no small rock hollows visible only from above. However, the captured images showed only sea reflections, cloud shadows, and the characteristic wet, slippery rock formations of Acadia, zero heat signals or shapes consistent with humans. K9 teams were redeployed in drier weather, but strong sea winds, cold rock surfaces, and constant alternation between open and forested areas created significant interference, markedly limiting scent detection. Still, the entire designated area had to be completed to standard. Every grid cell marked as searched, every high-risk fall location physically accessed to rule out trapped bodies or items. The interim report noted a few natural signs or unidentified traces, a rotted scrap of unrelated fabric not matching the students' clothing, faint old shoe prints from weeks prior, and an upturned tree root assessed as animal activity. No personal items, phones, backpacks, student IDs, or climbing gear were found. No fresh impact marks on rocks or landslide areas either, leading SR commanders to admit there was still no evidence Elena and Marcus had met with misfortune within the expanded 7 kilometers range. As the search stretched into the fifth day, participating forces began to fatigue, operational costs rose sharply, and deteriorating weather with intermittent cold rain prevented access to some already dangerous cliff sections. In the end-of-day evaluation meeting, representatives from SR, Acadia Rangers, and Hancock County Police agreed they had ruled out nearly every possibility of the students being trapped within the trail and coastal zones delineated. The summary report stated clearly, no traces, no belongings, no accident evidence, no indication of the students' next direction of travel after the camera captured them on Ocean Path. With no new data to guide further expansion, the Chief SARA commander recommended suspending on-site operations to avoid risking personnel, shifting focus to reanalyzing camera footage, park vehicle entry-exit logs, and scattered visitor statements from those days. Late afternoon on the sixth day, an official statement was issued. The active search phase for the disappearance of Elena Morell and Marcus Liu was suspended indefinitely due to no directional evidence obtained in either sweep phase. The families of both students were notified privately, along with a summary of actions taken and assurance that the case remained open to receive and process any new leads. However, per Maine state procedure, the case was reclassified as cold case after confirming no immediate actions could improve chances of locating the victims or related evidence. From that point, the missing persons file for the two exchange students officially entered passive status, depending entirely on future public tips or unexpected technical discoveries to potentially reopen investigation or mount supplemental searches. 7 years after the disappearance file of Elena Morell and Marcus Liu was moved to cold case status, on an early October morning, the outskirts of Ellsworth became the center of attention when a long-haul truck driver called 911 to report seeing a young man in an exhausted state, walking barefoot, staggering on the roadside near the Union River Bridge. When medical personnel approached, the man was wearing a torn thin jacket, faded khaki pants, and carried no identification whatsoever. His skin was pallid, body emaciated to the point where ribs were clearly visible under his shirt, hands covered in multiple scrapes, as though recently exposed for a long time to rough surfaces. He responded slowly, seemingly unaware of people speaking to him, answering only in disjointed, hard-to-understand fragments. When asked his name, he paused silently for a few seconds, then uttered two slurred syllables, sounding like Marcus, before collapsing onto the road. EMTs recorded low blood pressure, severe dehydration, prolonged physical exhaustion, and near-absent orientation reflexes. During preliminary checks in the ambulance, they noticed a dark, uneven, ring-like indentation on his left wrist, appearing as though it had been tightly bound by a soft but fixed material for an extended period. On his right shoulder, a thin scar ran down toward the shoulder blade, fully healed, but with irregular edges, suggesting skin tearing from a sharp object or metal edge. These details were logged in the report and forwarded when the patient was transported directly to the emergency room at Northern Light Maine Coast Hospital. Since he carried no identifying documents and couldn't answer basic questions, hospital staff admitted him as John Doe and began initial tests to assess overall condition. While doctors administered fluids and performed necessary checks, a night shift nurse happened to notice his facial features and jaw structure, thinking they closely resembled an image from a prior missing persons campaign. She cross-checked the open database and found the real-life description of the John Doe patient matched strikingly with details of one of the two students missing since 2014. Asian male, height approximately 5'9", 5'10", short black hair, small mole under the right jawbone, a feature Marcus Liu's family had confirmed in the original search file. The hospital immediately contacted the Maine State Police Major Crimes Unit via the internal emergency line for missing persons cases. About 2 hours later, a detective from the Major Crimes Unit arrived at the hospital to take initial statements, photograph for identification, and request biometric samples for comparison with old records. Upon contact, the detective observed the patient staring blankly into space, showing no awareness of his surroundings, occasionally whispering unintelligible fragmented sounds, but showing no reaction when tested by being called Marcus. Per the attending physician's preliminary assessment, the patient was in acute cognitive disorder, possibly from prolonged starvation, chronic sleep deprivation, severe vitamin deficiency, or even extended psychological trauma. All of his clothing was sealed per forensic protocol after discovering gray-black soil dust on the sleeve hems, unlike typical Ellsworth area dirt, plus a few fine fabric fibers caught in the stitching, potential environmental traces from where he had been. Once hemodynamically stabilized, the hospital transferred him to intensive care for close monitoring, while officially reporting to the State Missing Persons Data Center. There, as soon as images and identifying features were entered into the system, a high-confidence match appeared almost immediately, strong alignment with the file of Marcus Liu, the exchange student missing from Acadia 7 years earlier. The detective promptly contacted Marcus's family, requesting they fly to Maine Coast Hospital for direct confirmation preparation, while stressing that procedures must strictly follow victim protection standards, no contact or conversation with the patient until after initial medical and psychological evaluations. Before leaving the ICU, the investigative team requested the hospital impose an information lockdown, barring release of any identifying data to the press, to prevent public interference and reduce unintended pressure on the newly found individual. By day's end, an internal notification was sent to Maine State Police. A male individual, highly likely connected to the 2014 disappearance of the two exchange students at Acadia National Park, has been located in an exhausted state in Ellsworth. Attached was an urgent request to reactivate the cold case file, redirecting all efforts toward the hypothesis of prolonged survival under unlawful confinement or forced relocation over many years. Though not yet definitively confirmed, the degree of similarity between the found subject and Marcus's description was sufficient to elevate the case to top priority across Maine's investigative system, marking a complete shift to an entirely new phase after 7 years without any leads. That very night, while the patient was stabilized in the intensive care unit, the investigation team coordinated with the forensic unit to initiate the first step of the identification process, collecting fingerprints according to AFIS standards. Under the laboratory lights, each gaunt and calloused finger was rolled across the scanner's touch surface. The technician noted numerous small cracks running along the skin surface, typical signs of prolonged malnutrition and limited environmental exposure, but the ridge patterns remained sharp enough for the system to process. Just minutes later, the server returned the result, a high match with the fingerprint sample on file with the Immigration Service from when Marcus Liu entered the country in 2016 on an exchange student visa. However, per protocol, this was only considered a preliminary confirmation. The investigation team had to conduct at least 2 additional independent identification methods to avoid errors due to data mistakes or duplicate records. The second step was direct cross-referencing with information from the university Marcus had attended. Maine State Police contacted the International Records Office of the school in California, where Marcus had enrolled in the exchange program before arriving in Acadia. The records provided included the original photo from his student ID card, identification records kept by the International Student Office, height, weight, facial tuds and descriptions, and some basic biometric data collected during intake for international students. When the student ID photo of Marcus was placed next to the hospital photo of patient John Doe, the technician immediately noticed striking similarities: the hairline, the proportion between forehead and nose, the slightly upturned eye shape, and a small mole under the right jawbone. This last feature matched exactly with the description provided by the family in the 2016 missing person file, further strengthening the identification likelihood. Nevertheless, forensics still required the final confirmatory step, DNA. A blood sample was drawn from the patient and rushed that same night to the Maine State Laboratory, capable of running extended STR analysis. To obtain a direct comparison sample, police contacted Marcus's family in California and requested that they provide a DNA sample from the father or mother via an expedited collection kit. While awaiting the family sample, forensics used the immigration visa DNA data as supplementary reference. Less than 36 hours later, the lab reported preliminary results. The patient's DNA matched the immigration record at an extremely high level, virtually ruling out any mix-up with another individual. When the mother's DNA sample arrived, kinship analysis confirmed a mother-son relationship probability exceeding 99.99%, thereby definitively establishing that the emaciated man found in Ellsworth was Marcus Liu, the exchange student who had vanished from Acadia National Park 7 years earlier. The results were compiled into an official forensic report, signed by the lab director, and forwarded directly to Maine State Police headquarters. That same afternoon, an emergency meeting was convened at the Bangor headquarters to assess the implications of the positive identification. The first decision reached was to officially reactivate missing person case hash 2016 AC 2216, while simultaneously reclassifying it as a potential criminal investigation, due to the series of indicators on the victim's body: prolonged emaciation, ligature-like wrist marks, irregular healed scars, suggesting Marcus had likely been held captive or under unlawful control for an extended period. The investigative team requested retrieval of all archived materials: entrance camera footage from Acadia, vehicle entry-exit logs from the time of disappearance, all witness statements, cell phone signal data from before Marcus lost connection, and the original search maps. At the same time, they opened a new case number separate from the original missing person file, focusing specifically on investigating the cause of his prolonged survival and the mysterious 7-year disappearance, an outcome the team stated cannot be explained by standard accident patterns at Acadia. In parallel, the University of California, where Marcus had studied, was formally notified that their exchange student had been located. The university promptly forwarded all relevant records, copies of the exchange agreement, travel itinerary, Marcus's last emails before arriving in Maine, and minutes from departmental meetings when the 2016 disappearance was reported back to the school. Everything was sent directly to Maine's Major Crimes Unit to assist in reconstructing the timeline leading up to the victim's disappearance. The federal immigration authorities were also notified, given Marcus's reappearance without a passport, visa, or any documents potentially related to cross-border movement over many years. They opened an internal investigation branch to determine whether Marcus had ever left U.S. territory during the missing period or had been taken across a border unlawfully. In their report to Maine, USCIS emphasized that no exit record existed for Marcus from the time of disappearance to the present, reinforcing the assessment that he had likely been held within U.S. territory for the entire 7 years. At the conclusion of the verification phase, an official determination was issued. The patient identified as John Doe found in Ellsworth is Marcus Liu. The condition of his body and level of cognitive impairment raised strong suspicion of prolonged captivity. The 2016 missing persons files for 2 students at Acadia are reopened and reclassified as criminal investigations. With this critical milestone, the case that had seemed closed 7 years earlier suddenly opened in an entirely new direction, no longer centered on the accident hypothesis that had prevailed for years, but shifting to a complex criminal case with elements of organized wrongdoing, compelling Maine state investigators to rebuild the entire timeline from the day Marcus vanished in order to determine where he had been, who had held him, and what had happened to Elena Morell, the person still unaccounted for. The medical evaluation report, completed immediately after Marcus Liu's identity was confirmed, became one of the most critical documents in the entire reopened investigation. It not only described the victim's biological condition at the time of discovery, but also provided powerful indicators that he had endured a prolonged period of captivity in an environment with severely restricted movement, minimal natural light exposure, inadequate nutrition, and basic environmental deprivation. When the initial blood test results came back, physicians at Maine Coast Hospital documented severe deficiencies across multiple micronutrient groups, vitamin D near the absolute minimum threshold for maintaining bone function, chronically low levels of vitamins B1, B6, and B12, indicating years of nutrient-poor diet, sharply reduced albumin and total plasma protein, reflecting chronic energy deficit, and extremely low ferritin levels, confirming long-term iron deficiency. These findings could not have developed over weeks or months. They were the result of continuous malnutrition spanning many years. X-ray and CT bone imaging revealed bone density comparable to that of an elderly person or someone long-term immobilized, thinned femoral shafts, demineralized forearm bones, and smaller than normal epiphyses for a 26-year-old. Orthopedic specialists concluded that such changes occur only when a patient lives in a severely movement-restricted environment, no free ambulation, no weight-bearing activity, or only repetitive small movements within a confined space. Ultrasound of major muscle groups showed pronounced atrophy in the quadriceps, gluteals, and lower abdominals, with a severely imbalanced fat-to-muscle ratio, indicating Marcus had been unable to maintain normal physical activity for an extended period, potentially years. Examination of ankle and wrist ligaments revealed chronic repetitive microtrauma injuries, irregular scar tissue, uneven tendon healing, and circumferential skin compression patterns around both left and right wrists. Under fluorescent examination, forensic analysts observed symmetrical lesions around the wrists with abnormally thickened skin interspersed with thin groove lines. Classic signs of prolonged contact with a soft but continuously pressurizing material, such as cloth straps, leather straps, or padded handcuffs, designed to reduce abrasion. Similar injury patterns existed at the ankles, indicating that for a long period, Marcus may have had both arms and legs restrained, possibly through cyclic binding or fixation within a confined space. Head and spine MRI showed no acute trauma but mild edema in the hippocampal region, an area linked to long-term memory, which neurologists attributed to possible chronic stress, persistent insomnia, or severe psychological trauma. EEG recorded abnormal low-amplitude fluctuations suggestive of a long-standing, rather than recent-onset cognitive disorder. Combining these findings with nursing observations that Marcus reflexively curled up at sudden noises, avoided bright light, and slept only in short bursts, physicians increasingly supported the hypothesis of a coercive, sensory-deprived living environment, possibly a confined space sustained over many years. Microbiology and toxicology screens showed no evidence of common narcotics or sedatives, but markers consistent with a monotonous, low-protein, high-cheap carbohydrate diet almost devoid of fruits or vegetables. This led to speculation that whoever or whatever group controlled Marcus lacked substantial resources or deliberately kept his nutrition at bare minimum levels to maintain dependence and physical weakness. Repeat lab tests later indicated that nutritional recovery would require many months, a timeline inconsistent with transient homelessness or voluntary isolation, but fully consistent with long-term controlled captivity and restricted feeding. In the consolidated report sent to Maine State Police, the medical team leader concluded, skeletal, nutritional, and soft tissue findings are entirely consistent with the patient having lived in a severely movement-restricted environment for a minimum of several years. Repetitive wrist and ankle lesions strongly suggest periodic fixation by restraints or binding devices. No indicators support the hypothesis of survival in the wild, disorientation, or isolation due to accident. The report also highlighted supporting indirect details, abnormally thickened fingernails with cyclic Bose lines, signs of prolonged physiological stress, markedly elevated baseline cortisol, altered pigmentation on the upper back and shoulders, consistent with predominant artificial rather than natural light exposure, and chronically thin, darkened under-eye skin indicative of long-term sleep deprivation. Together, they formed a coherent picture. Marcus had not simply gone missing, he had existed in a controlled, externally isolated environment under an abnormal daily regimen for 7 years. Physicians stressed that survival in such a state is only possible if the victim is maintained at a bare minimum level to prevent death while ensuring continued physical debilitation, a pattern commonly seen in deliberate long-term captivity cases. The report closed with a key statement to investigators. The patient's physical condition is not the result of an accident nor of vagrancy. It is evidence of a structured, controlled, and cyclic process of prolonged detention. This assessment became the foundation for the entire subsequent investigative direction, forcing Maine State Police to revisit hypotheses previously dismissed 7 years earlier, and opening the possibility that the 2 students had not simply vanished in the woods, but had been taken and held by an organized actor. Immediately after the medical team concluded that Marcus showed signs of long-term captivity, the clinical psychology department at Maine Coast Hospital, in collaboration with a forensic psychiatrist dispatched from Bangor, began a detailed assessment of his cognitive impairment level and memory recovery potential, as the entire next phase of the investigation depended on determining whether Marcus could provide reliable information. The first test focused on dissociative amnesia, a common psychological defense mechanism in victims of prolonged captivity, psychological torture, or repeated trauma. When asked to recount the most recent events he could recall, Marcus could only produce fragmented, disjointed pieces without clear sequence, sometimes merely spatial sensations, such as dark, cold, metallic smell, completely lacking orienting elements like names, places, or times. Specialists noted this aligned with acute dissociative presentation, in which the brain severs traumatic memories from conscious awareness to minimize damage. When shifting to long-term memory testing, Marcus could recall his own name after repeated prompting, but could not remember how he arrived in Maine, did not recognize images of Acadia, and could not conjure any details related to the time of his disappearance 7 years earlier. This indicated that the memory blockade extended not only through the captivity period but backward as well, creating a large gap that experts termed retrograde amnesia, triggered by prolonged captivity. Nevertheless, the team assessed that Marcus's memories were not erased, but rather locked away, meaning that with the right approach, certain fragments could potentially be recovered in stages. During sensory identification testing, Marcus reacted strongly to the sound of metal clanging together and flinched when room lights were suddenly turned on, cues suggesting latent memory associations with an artificial enclosed environment. This allowed the team to delineate an exploitable memory range, nonverbal landmarks, auditory sensations, light changes, air odors, and spatial structures. These are primitive sensory memories that tend to persist even when event-based memories are dissociated. Analysts determined that focusing on these elements would yield far higher chances of recovering leads than attempting to force recall of specific details, such as names or locations, which could cause further harm and drive memories deeper underground. When tested with exposure cues, Marcus displayed a mix of fear and avoidance upon hearing the steady low hum of industrial ventilation fans, a sound common in basements or enclosed facilities. This became one of the earliest significant indicators that the captivity environment may have featured a mechanical ventilation system. Additionally, when exposed to simulated damp earth odor, Marcus showed no reaction, but became extremely tense upon smelling machine oil. This reinforced the hypothesis that the holding location was not a natural forest or cave, but more likely a small industrial area, enclosed workshop or basement with basic mechanical equipment. Defining this range of memory and sensory responses was a prerequisite for Maine State Police to understand what types of information could be elicited and the risks involved in questioning. Based on the psychological evaluation, Marcus was classified as high-sensitivity interview subject, meaning any direct questioning about the past 7 years could trigger panic, destabilization, or reactivation of dissociation. Therefore, investigators were required to employ the cognitive interview protocol, a method designed to elicit memories by avoiding suggestion, reducing retrieval pressure, and allowing the subject to reconstruct details through sensory impressions rather than forced event recall. In their report, the psychologist recommended 4 key principles: avoid closed questions, refrain from leading judgments, do not press for names or locations until basic memory structure is established, and above all, follow the subject's emotional pacing without coercive direction. They also advised dividing interviews into multiple short sessions, each no longer than 20 minutes, with interspersed rest periods to prevent defensive reflex activation. In the final evaluation report, the psychology team concluded that although Marcus currently could not provide factual event testimony, he still possessed a usable sensory memory system, particularly environmental elements, sounds, and spatial textures that could guide the investigation. These components are typically the least erased in dissociation cases, stemming from prolonged captivity. This laid the groundwork for a specialized interrogation strategy in the next phase, while also raising the possibility that Marcus could become a core source of information if the memory elicitation process was conducted correctly, safely, and without exceeding his psychological tolerance threshold. Based on the psychological evaluation from the previous phase, Maine State Police, in collaboration with the cognitive forensic specialist team, began the memory extraction process using the sensory element isolation method, focusing entirely on the nonverbal information fragments that Marcus's brain still retained after 7 years of captivity. In the first session, when asked to describe any sounds he could recall, Marcus mentioned a steady, continuous hum, not loud but always present overhead, describing it as similar to the sound of an exhaust fan installed in an industrial air circulation system. He also recalled that this sound sometimes changed in rhythm, faster during certain hours, then slower, a characteristic often seen in cyclically operating equipment or simple heating systems used in enclosed structures. The specialists isolated this sound group and cross-referenced it with the existing or formerly existing infrastructure catalog within the Acadia area, finding that it did not match natural sounds such as wind whistling through rock crevices or ocean waves. but aligned more closely with an artificial mechanical environment. When shifting to temperature analysis, Marcus described a feeling of always cold underfoot, but no draft, while also remembering having to curl his feet up when sleeping because the floor surface was hard and cold like stone. This led the investigative team to hypothesize that the floor where he was held might be concrete, cement, or polished stone, materials commonly used in basements, underground levels, or self-built industrial cabins, rather than wood or soil, since wood tends to retain heat better and natural soil rarely produces such uniform coldness. The team also noted that the temperature data described by Marcus appeared stable with little seasonal variation, reinforcing the hypothesis that he was in a space isolated from the external environment and likely insulated. The next step was isolating material-related memories. Marcus could not describe them verbally, but his physical reactions when allowed to touch various test material samples showed the greatest familiarity with smooth cold metal surfaces, painted steel, and coarse canvas fabric, types often used in binding straps or suspension ropes. When his hand was placed on raw wood, there was no reaction, but upon touching perforated steel, he whispered noisy, vibrating, suggesting he had once been near breathable structured metal material, possibly steel grating or industrial ventilation panels. At the same time, when exposed to light tapping on steel pipes, Marcus immediately flinched, indicating memories of an environment heavy with metal materials. This led the investigative team to rule out simple structures, such as wooden cabins or temporary shelters built by tourists or loggers. Shifting focus to structures with solid foundations or small bunkers constructed during World War II within the Acadia area and adjacent Washington County. Another specialist group focused on analyzing odor-related memories. When Marcus was presented with the smell of forest soil, he showed no reaction. When exposed to pine resin, common in Acadia, he displayed no emotional reflex. But when approaching the smell of machine oil and hot metal, his heart rate increased noticeably. This eliminated the possibility that the holding environment was in a forest or natural rock cave, and strengthened the conjecture of a space with basic machinery present, such as a small generator, motor-driven ventilation system, or old heating equipment. The damp but not moldy smell described by Marcus also suggested the presence of a ventilation system, as long-sealed unventilated rooms typically develop heavy mold odor. From these fragmented memory pieces, the investigative team constructed an environmental classification table listing key elements: cyclic ventilation fan, concrete or equivalent flooring, enclosed but not completely stifling space, presence of metal, steady vibration noise, machine oil smell, strong artificial lighting activated on a schedule. Combining these factors, their initial model leaned toward a small-scale bunker or underground structure, possibly hand-built in the 1960s, 1980s, and later abandoned. To verify, the forensic geography team collected archive maps of Acadia and surrounding areas, particularly records of civilian structures, old military facilities, abandoned radar stations, coastal road maintenance shops from the New Deal era, and storage facilities once used by the Department of the Interior. Some small bunkers near Otter Point and Schoodic Peninsula had long been filled or sealed, but old records indicated several structures remained incompletely surveyed because they lay off main trails. Simultaneously, based on Marcus's sensory descriptions, the specialist team created a three-dimensional spatial model, recreating the elements he remembered. Low ceiling fluorescent or old LED lights, flat walls without wooden structure, minimum room size, 2.5 x 3 meters, a continuous mechanical vibration source, and the likely presence of a metal door or small hatch used for passing food. When Marcus was shown this model in simple geometric form, undetailed to avoid false memory creation, he reacted by touching the simulated wall and whispering, "Yes," like cold. This was the strongest response throughout the entire memory extraction phase and was regarded as confirmation that the spatial model was on the right track. The investigative team added sensory data on light direction when Marcus was asked if he ever saw natural light. He shook his head and shielded his eyes when direct light was simulated, indicating the captivity environment had no windows or openings, allowing sunlight. Another important factor was the description of slight floor vibration, leading experts to speculate the structure might be near a truck road, service road, or above an old pipeline, as ground vibration often stems from traffic, subsurface equipment, or fixed generators. When cross-referenced with Acadia's geological maps and technical road networks, several areas with former maintenance roads closed since the 1980s entered the survey list. From all these elements, the final spatial model proposed by the specialist team described a small bunker or semi-permanent underground cabin built with concrete and steel, relatively soundproof, with basic ventilation, artificial lighting, and small-scale mechanical equipment. This preliminary conclusion was forwarded to Maine State Police as a strategic investigative direction, narrowed down locations capable of containing small underground structures in or near Acadia, and cross-check with field data. This marked the first time in 7 years that investigators had obtained a clear directional environmental description based on Marcus's nonverbal memory fragments, yet sufficiently robust to infer a viable spatial model, paving the way to locate the actual holding site. Immediately after the captivity spatial model was constructed from Marcus's nonverbal memories, Maine State Police shifted focus to analyzing remaining trace evidence on his clothing and body, treating it as an independent geographic tracing avenue to verify and narrow suspect areas. All clothing Marcus was wearing, when found in Ellsworth, the faded thin jacket, khaki pants, worn inner shirt, was sealed and sent to the state's geobiology laboratory. There, technicians isolated microsoil samples adhering to sleeve hems, pant seams, and shirt tails. The tiny particle soil samples were analyzed via infrared spectroscopy and X-ray diffraction, yielding a mixture of silicate minerals, thin mica, minor weathered feldspar, and notably the presence of ilmenite, a titanium iron mineral typically found only in certain Maine coastal areas with specific metamorphic rock formations. The ilmenite presence ruled out Marcus having been deep in inland forest or granite-dominated soil zones without marine sediment influence. Analysis of ultrafine salt crystals trapped in the jacket stitching revealed high sodium chloride levels, but not pure sea salt. Instead, it showed aerosol salt forms common in sheltered bay coastal air, where winds are light, humidity high, and salt spray does not travel far, as it does at Acadia's open cliffs. Concurrently, the microbiology team isolated spores and microfungi remaining on the collar and inner fabric layers. Results revealed 3 characteristic microbial strains, Cladosporium salsulae, primarily found at old facilities near still water, Aspergillus insuitus, common in low-light enclosed environments with artificial ventilation, and a variant soil Pseudomonas strain, recorded only in areas with peat, mixed with lakeside sand layers. Cross-referencing the 3 geobiology datasets, minerals, aerosol salt, and microbes, the experts built an environmental overlap matrix to identify areas matching all 3 indicators simultaneously. Within a 30 kilometers radius around Acadia, only 3 waterfront zones met the criteria. The marsh west of Bass Harbor, a narrow section of Southwest Harbor, and the Seal Cove area, a lakeside zone with peat mud, ilmenite-rich sediment, and a history of many boat maintenance facilities and semi-permanent storage buildings from the 1960s. When expanding the matrix with microbiology data, the first 2 areas were eliminated because Cladosporium salsulae spores occurred at highest frequency in abandoned underground structures near Seal Cove, per a 2009 geobiology study archived at the University of Maine. What drew investigators' deeper attention was that Seal Cove once hosted a series of warehouses and fuel storage bunkers serving the fishing fleet, later closed and sealed after the area repurposed. Some structures no longer appear on current maps, but remain in old records of the Coastal Resource Management Agency. Based on this, Maine State Police designated Seal Cove as the primary focus zone. Further analysis from Marcus's memories, ground vibration, machine oil smell, cold floor, ventilation fan noise, was added to the matrix as indicators of mechanical equipment, metal construction, and possible proximity to old service roads. Cross-referencing with historical geological maps identified a fuel pipeline that once ran through Seal Cove from the 1970s as a significant match. Structures serving this pipeline were built semi-underground to retain heat and resist sea wind corrosion, aligning with the bunker model derived from Marcus's descriptions. The laboratory continued examining fine fibers on Marcus's clothing, finding coarse polyethylene fibers, material commonly used to wrap technical pipes or as moisture-proof liners in old bunkers. This material is rare in nature and unmatched to any tourist area in Acadia, further supporting the hypothesis of confinement in an engineered underground structure. Hair sample analysis from Marcus showed elevated lead and zinc levels in cycles, exposure patterns typically linked to oxidized old metal environments, such as steel bunker interiors or abandoned warehouses. These indicators once again directed full attention to Seal Cove, where local records noted numerous empty metal storage units never fully inventoried. With geobiology, mineral, and microbial data converging on a single area, Maine State Police convened an interagency meeting to determine the next approach. The forensic geography team recommended ground-based LIDAR, scanning for subsurface anomalies suitable for detecting partially buried or vegetation-covered underground structures. Meanwhile, the old infrastructure team provided a list of 14 former structures around Seal Cove, including fuel bunkers, pump stations, tool storage, and 2 semi-underground structures of unclear purpose built between 1968 and 1972. These 2 were marked no longer in use since 1989, but notes indicated they were never fully dismantled, only access points filled to prevent public entry. When this information was presented to the cognitive specialist team, they agreed the old semi-underground structures at Seal Cove best matched Marcus's memory model. The investigative team immediately compared soil depth maps and identified at least 3 suspect locations with box-shaped geological anomalies, typical signatures of buried man-made structures. In the end-of-day meeting, the Maine State Police commander approved a 3-step search plan for underground structures at Seal Cove. Wide-area LIDAR scan to pinpoint anomalies precisely, seismic camera measurement of subsurface voids, and if a structure is confirmed, controlled excavation with forensic team support to preserve evidence and avoid altering potential scenes. With the first focused geographic tracing lid after 7 years of deadlock, the investigative force officially transitioned from indirect analysis to active field search, directing all resources to Seal Cove, the sole area to date converging full chemical, mineralogical, microbiological, and victim memory evidence, opening hope of locating the underground structure where Marcus may have been held during his disappearance. Right after the Seal Cove survey plan was approved, Maine State Police coordinated with the forensic geology team to deploy the GPR system to scan all 3 areas showing subsurface anomalies. The low-frequency GPR equipment was towed along parallel lines, creating a layered subsurface wave reflection map according to geological strata. In the first scan session, 2 suspicious points were ruled out because the reflection signals indicated they were merely voids caused by decayed tree roots or natural cavities. However, at the 3rd location, approximately 120 meters from the edge of Seal Cove Lake and covered by a thick organic layer, GPR detected a rectangular reflective mass with straight edges and unusually high reflection density, indicating the presence of a large metallic object buried at a depth of about 1.8 meters. The 3-tiered waveform response is characteristic of flat-surfaced steel or alloy, a material that does not occur naturally in the local geological composition. The data was processed into 3D imaging software, revealing an underground object shaped like a rectangular box, measuring approximately 3.2 x 4.5 meters, closely matching the spatial model constructed by the specialist team based on Marcus's nonverbal memories. That same day, the area was fully cordoned off, fenced, and all participating personnel were required to wear protective gear to avoid contaminating the scene. The technical team used a core drill to create a small inspection access point, minimizing structural impact. When the drill bit penetrated the soil and struck the metal surface, it produced the classic aged steel sound, deep, heavy, with resonant vibration traveling up the drill bit, consistent with industrial-grade alloy used in bunkers from the previous century. After confirming structural stability, the investigation team decided to create an access opening by manually excavating around the area to preserve the scene intact. As the soil was gradually removed, a rectangular steel plate emerged, covered with a thin layer of moss and old earth clinging to the edges. On the steel plate surface were faint rust marks and two nearly fully recessed hinge bolts, indicating this entrance had been naturally sealed for many decades. The forensic team inserted an endoscope camera through the newly opened narrow gap to check for toxic gases and internal conditions. Air filtration sensors showed that while the bunker environment was old, levels of methane or hydrogen sulfide did not exceed hazardous thresholds, allowing for wider access. When the steel plate was lifted using hydraulic jacks, a thick, pitch-black void appeared, releasing a rush of cold metallic odor mixed with dampness, exactly matching Marcus's description of heavy air with the smell of thinned machine oil. High-powered flashlights revealed a narrow steel staircase, descending about 2 meters. The interior structure consisted of raw, unfinished concrete with flat walls, a low ceiling, and an old ventilation fan mounted offset to the right, consistent with the vibrating sound Marcus had reacted to during interviews. Inside the bunker was a single room, but large enough for long-term confinement of one person, bare concrete floor, a metal sheet bed frame bolted against the wall, remnants of a failed fluorescent ceiling light fixture, and crude old-style electrical wiring running along the ceiling edges. Everything inside was covered in a layer of dust, except for 3 areas beside the bed, beneath the ventilation fan, and along one wall corner showing repeated friction marks. These were zones the forensics team assessed as having had more recent human contact relative to the age of the structure. The forensic team immediately began collecting DNA samples, skin dust, hair traces, and fabric fiber traces from all used surfaces. Near the metal bed area, technicians discovered numerous desquamated epithelial skin cells compatible with retention times of 1-3 years. On-site rapid scanning analysis produced an initial DNA profile that partially matched Marcus Liu in one sample, reinforcing the conclusion that this was the place where he had been held. However, a more striking discovery emerged when the team collected hair strands longer than 20 centimeters in the left corner of the room. The hair had a completely different structure from Marcus's finer, softer, lighter pigment, and far longer than Marcus's hairstyle at the time of his disappearance. Rapid testing showed that this DNA sample partially matched the archived profile of Elena Morel. This result shifted the entire investigation team from verification mode to emergency status, as it represented the first physical evidence proving Elena had been present in this bunker at some point during the past 7 years. The discovery of Elena's DNA also implied that Marcus had not been held alone. The captivity pattern may have involved multiple phases or multiple victims. Continuing the bunker scan, technicians found repeated scratch marks on the ceiling near the ventilation fan, indicating prolonged operation of the device, matching Marcus's description of looped mechanical sounds. On the floor near the entrance, they found a small fragment of nylon fiber material consistent with the soft restraint cords that left indentations on Marcus's wrists. A decayed scrap of paper was discovered wedged between the bed frame and the wall. Though the text was illegible, under UV light the forensics team identified traces of blue ink, suggesting it had once been a note page or label. All evidence was collected according to strict protocol, packaged in cross-contamination-proof containers, and immediately transported to the laboratory. In parallel with DNA sampling, the forensics team collected microbial samples from walls and floors. These samples showed significant overlap with the microbiota on Marcus's clothing, particularly the strain Aspergillus insuatus, confirming the bunker maintained a sealed environment with artificial ventilation, consistent with Marcus's reflexive responses to related sounds and odors. Upon full data recording, the forensics team produced a detailed bunker schematic, including dimensions, bed position, fan location, electrical wiring, and entry-exit points. Everything aligned unusually well with the spatial model Marcus described through sensation, from wall vibration locations to the timbre of artificial lighting. This was regarded as the strongest link between the victim's nonverbal memory and a real crime scene. In the report sent to Maine State Police that same day, the forensics team concluded the underground structure at Seal Cove is a highly probable detention site for Marcus Liu during his period of disappearance. The DNA evidence also confirms the presence of Elena Morel, establishing that the female victim was at this location at some point. With this discovery, the case shifted from speculative to full criminal investigation, marking the first major turning point since the two students vanished, and raising a larger question: who built and operated this underground facility for years without detection? Based on DNA samples, microbial evidence, metal oxidation levels, and internal wear marks inside the Seal Cove bunker, combined with Marcus's medical records, Maine State Police began reconstructing the entire 7-year captivity process. The focus was on building a sufficiently detailed timeline to infer the perpetrator's behavior patterns and operational rules, while determining the phases when Marcus and Elena were present at the bunker. First, the materials forensics team analyzed the aging condition of the ceiling steel, rust points, and corrosion cycles at contact areas. Vertical drag marks on the steel walls showed 2 layers, an older layer worn nearly smooth, and a newer layer with clearer abrasion, indicating the bunker was used in at least 2 distinct phases. Notably, the metal bed area exhibited deeper wear marks, suggesting prolonged body pressure consistent with fixed confinement periods. Combined with medical data, severe bone density loss, quadriceps atrophy, Call used soft tissue from lack of movement. The investigation team constructed a preliminary timeline with 6 main phases. Phase 1. Abduction. Based on the disappearance timing at Acadia and soil traces matching transitional zones along trail edges, investigators believe the perpetrator abducted Elena and Marcus within a 1-kilometer radius of Ocean Path, likely via a low-traffic side access. The clean disappearance without signs of struggle or scattered items indicates a highly controlled method, possibly weapon intimidation or rapid incapacitation, likely from behind, followed by immediate binding. Phase 2. Transport. Analysis of dust in clothing seams revealed composite particles from old model car carpeting, suggesting the victims were transported in a low-clearance vehicle, enclosed box truck, or small van along routes, avoiding parked checkpoints. The absence of camera footage also indicates the perpetrator was familiar with secondary exits or old service gates in Acadia. Phase 3. Fixed confinement. Based on DNA overlap, microbial matches, and spatial characteristics, the Seal Cove bunker served as the primary detention site. Stratified microbial dating showed human presence beginning about 1 year after the disappearance, aligning with Marcus's muscle damage, indicating at least 5-6 years of severely restricted movement. Elena's DNA presence in the bunker proves she was held there, but only in short-cycle traces on certain surfaces, leading investigators to conclude her time in the bunker was limited to an early phase before separation or some other event occurred. Phase 4. Bunker maintenance. Thin new paint layers on ventilation fan edges and fresh cement patching around wall corners indicate the perpetrator performed repairs or reinforcements at least twice. Once roughly 3 years after the disappearance, and again less than 2 years ago, based on surface oxidation evidence. This shows the perpetrator not only held victims, but actively maintained the facility long-term, indicating planning and basic technical capability. Phase 5, ration reduction. Bo's lines on Marcus's fingernails showed repeated multi-month malnutrition cycles recurring every 8–10 months. Inside the bunker, microfiber nylon food wrapper fragments, mostly cheap carbohydrate-based, indicated increasingly minimal and monotonous rations, reflecting a change in perpetrator behavior, either deliberate victim weakening to reduce resistance risk or cost-cutting in maintenance. Phase 6, release or abandonment. Scene evidence at Seal Cove shows the bunker unused for the past 6–8 months. Fresh dust accumulation was thick, and the final Marcus skin cell samples were estimated at no more than 1 year old. This suggests the perpetrator ceased bunker access in the final months, leading to Marcus's extreme debilitation to the point of being unable to stand unaided. Given his physical condition upon recovery, dehydration, disorientation, severe micronutrient deficiency, investigators believe he was released or abandoned in an uncontrolled state, possibly after an unintended event or when the perpetrator deemed him no longer capable of providing useful information. After constructing the timeline, the investigation team focused on analyzing the perpetrator's behavioral pattern. Maintaining the bunker over many years required technical knowledge, material access, and high discipline in concealing activity. The perpetrator exhibited traits of a custodial captor, long-term control-oriented detention, without acute physical torture signs. Rations were kept at bare minimum, not to kill but to weaken. Wall patching and ventilation system painting show close monitoring of facility degradation and proactive repairs to extend usability. This indicates premeditated rather than impulsive behavior. Based on microbial stratification, Elena's DNA appearing at lower levels than Marcus's led to the conclusion that she was only present in the early phase and then vanished from the trace sequence, opening the hypothesis that the perpetrator separated the victims or moved Elena elsewhere. The overall pattern suggests the perpetrator likely lived or worked near Seal Cove, was familiar with old infrastructure, and had prior access to the abandoned underground facility. The 7-year timeline not only reconstructs Marcus's captivity journey, but also reveals the perpetrator operated on regular calculated cycles while hiding behind seemingly innocuous activity to sustain a secret detention structure on Mount Desert Peninsula, undetected for nearly a decade. Based on the 7-year detention timeline and the bunker structure at Seal Cove, Maine State Police moved into the suspect narrowing phase using the reverse tracing of construction materials, a technique commonly employed in investigations of illegal underground structures. The starting point was 3 specific material groups found in the bunker: industrial-grade heavy-duty steel hinges, non-standard size corrosion-resistant steel plates, and nylon-coated chain that left distinctive marks on Marcus's wrists. These materials cannot be purchased at ordinary civilian stores and typically only appear in engineering projects, industrial warehouses, or liquidated old surplus stock. The investigation team first cross-referenced the hinges recovered from the bunker with the state's construction materials database. On the hinge surface, the oxidized rust layer allowed extraction of a faint stamped mark, SF12B, the designation for heavy-load bunker door hinges from the 1970s, produced only by 2 machine shops in Bangor and Portland. Liquidation records from these 2 shops showed that large quantities of SF12B hinges were sold in 3 batches between 2012 and 2014, mostly to individual retail buyers in quantities under 20 units each. This produced a narrow customer list. The team requested extraction of all retail sales invoices from those 3 years, filtered to the Mount Desert Island area and vicinity to narrow down individuals with potential access to Seal Cove. Out of 148 invoices total, only 19 belonged to addresses within a 30 kilometers radius of Acadia. To narrow further, police compared batch codes on the bunker steel plates. Metallurgical crystal analysis showed the bunker plates were old high-carbon alloy steel with 3 rare characteristics: uniform grain face, internal stamp located near the edge, and non-commercial current standard thickness. When cross-checked against the two shops' records, only 4 shipments matched these traits, all sold in 2013. Ultimately, only 8 individuals and 2 businesses remained as customers of these steel batches. Continuing to filter the list, police matched purchasing behavior to bunker characteristics. The quantity of plates bought in a single transaction had to be sufficient to build at least 3 walls. This eliminated 3 individuals who bought only 1-2 plates for personal property repairs. 5 individuals remained with 2013 transactions, matching the profile. The team added analysis of the specialized chain. This chain type features nylon fiber weave combined with a soft steel core, commonly used in large livestock facilities or industrial containment buildings to reduce injury to restrained subjects. It is not sold in supermarkets or general hardware stores. Tracing customer lists from the 4 in-state chain suppliers, only 3 people in the Mount Desert Island area had purchased small quantities of this chain between 2013 and 2015. One of those 3 appeared simultaneously in both lists, purchasing 2013 steel and 2014 chain. A notable coincidence. That person was Gareth Rowan, residing in a solitary cabin approximately 4 kilometers as the crow flies from Seal Cove. Gareth Rowan, 52 years old, is a freelance mechanic living in isolation. No family, who previously worked for a local boat repair company before abruptly quitting in 2011. Civil records show he was cited for trespassing in 2008, disorderly conduct in 2009, and illegal hunting in 2012. All minor offenses, but sketching a profile of someone familiar with forest activity and inclined to avoid social interaction. What drew greater police attention was that Rowan had once lived near the old Seal Cove warehouse district, where the region's largest material liquidation sale occurred in 2014, including all 3 matching material types found in the bunker. While reviewing crews who had accessed abandoned underground structures at Seal Cove during that period, investigators discovered Rowan was on the local permit list for access to old pipeline maintenance areas in 2012. This meant he had detailed knowledge of underground structures in the region, a factor consistent with building or modifying a bunker. The team requested Rowan's detailed purchase records. 3 standout transactions emerged. Purchase of 4 non-standard size steel plates in 2013. Purchase of 5 sets of SF-12B steel hinges the same year, and purchase of nylon-coated chain in 2014. Shortly afterward, another detail surfaced in tax records. Rowan reported purchasing a used 1998 model generator in 2015, matching the looped engine sound Marcus described and consistent with a mechanical device removed from the bunker. When aligning the events, police began constructing a probability model. 1. Rowan possessed mechanical knowledge sufficient to maintain a bunker. 2. Rowan purchased steel and hinges matching the recovered materials. 3. Rowan was one of very few people with permits to access old infrastructure zones at Seal Cove. 4. Rowan's cabin lay within a radius, allowing transport of 2 victims without passing heavily trafficked routes. Additionally, from the prior offender behavioral profiling section, the team determined the perpetrator was highly likely to be an isolated individual with hands-on skills, access to old industrial materials, and a tendency to maintain controlled victim processes rather than impulsive acts. These traits matched Rowan's psychosocial profile almost completely. To strengthen suspicion, Maine State Police gathered further data from neighbors. Residents in the area confirmed Rowan rarely communicated, frequently entered the woods for hours or even full days, and often transported old materials using a small truck without a front license plate. One reported hearing a generator running inside Rowan's cabin at night, unusual since most locals use grid power. Another recalled seeing Rowan buy large quantities of dry food and bottled water throughout 2015, 2017, unclear for what purpose since he lived alone. Police continued collecting financial transaction records and found Rowan made small but regular purchases at area mechanical supply stores, repair tools and old lighting equipment, consistent with bunker traces showing a multi-year electrical system operation. All this evidence was insufficient for charges alone, but formed a strong probabilistic set asserting Rowan as the only individual in the investigation converging motive potential, means, and opportunity. In the summary report to command, the analysis unit concluded, Gareth Rowan is the highest weighted suspect based on material matches, activity history, residence location, and behavior consistent with the offender profile. Thus, from the inorganic clues of steel, hinges, and chain, the material sourcing process enabled identification of a specific individual, one who possessed every condition to build, maintain, and operate a secret bunker over 7 years, and the first to come squarely into the expanded investigation sites. After identifying Gareth Rowan as the highest-weighted suspect based on material traces and activity records, Maine State Police launched a covert surveillance phase to gather direct evidence before any approach or action. A special task force was positioned within a 500-meter radius of Rowan's cabin, using long-range cameras and directional audio recording to monitor behavior, while establishing observation points along the 3 routes Rowan commonly used when moving into the woods or into town. During the first 2 weeks of surveillance, they recorded unusual habits. Rowan often left the cabin early morning with a large backpack, heading deep into the forest along unmarked trails, sometimes disappearing from view for many hours. Upon return, the backpack was typically lighter, but contents unclear. This behavior aligned with an offender pattern of secretly accessing an underground facility or related location. To avoid alerting him, the surveillance team did not intervene but focused on collecting waste, a potential DNA source. Rowan's cabin was about 200 meters from the main road, with no public trash collection, so he usually burned or dumped trash into a pit behind the cabin. When he left the cabin for 3 consecutive days, the task force took the opportunity to approach the dump pit and collect intact items: a wire brush with attached hair, a soda can with lip marks, a piece of gauze with dried skin cells, and an old pair of cloth gloves. All were sealed and immediately sent to the forensic lab for analysis. DNA results from the wire brush showed a male profile fully matching the skin cells found on the vent fan edge inside the Seal Cove bunker. The gauze skin cells yielded the same result, reinforcing a direct link between Rowan and the scene where Marcus was held. Notably, the second DNA profile, long hair found in the bunker presumed to be Elena's, did not appear in Rowan's trash, but this did not reduce suspicion. Instead, it indicated bunker samples were not contaminated by Rowan's household DNA, increasing analysis reliability. Once DNA was confirmed, the team shifted to more detailed behavior tracking. In the 3rd week of surveillance, Rowan was recorded carrying small mechanical tools, pliers, wrench, electrical wire coil, into the woods and returning with clothing covered in gray-black soil containing ilmenite, similar to soil samples from the Seal Cove bunker. This led police to believe Rowan continued accessing one or more old structures in the area. Additionally, infrared cameras captured him occasionally visiting areas with no official trails, locations closely matching old maintenance route maps collected by Maine State Police from archives. His familiar, unhesitating movement pattern indicated Rowan knew exactly where he was going, and these access paths were not spontaneous or newly discovered. Meanwhile, Rowan's financial activity was monitored, no large transactions but frequent small purchases of long shelf-life food, batteries, machine oil and repair tools from 3 local stores. The regular weekly or bi-weekly purchase cycle matched the offender pattern of maintaining an already built underground facility outlined in the timeline section. Another key factor was Rowan's reaction to strangers in the area. During one surveillance instance, when a group of lost hikers approached near his cabin, cameras captured Rowan watching them tensely from a distance before heading straight into the woods via a side path. Strong avoidance behavior suggesting fear of discovery rather than ordinary disturbance. This behavioral data was analyzed by the state's criminal behavior specialist, who concluded Rowan's activity pattern fit the covert control offender type, sporadic, cyclical, performed only when unobserved, and always maintaining social distance. Combining all data, matching DNA, material purchase history, access to old infrastructure, forest behavior, purposeful movement patterns, and avoidance level. The forensic team presented a report recommending that the probability of Rowan's involvement in building and operating the Seal Cove bunker exceeds 90%. This report became the foundation for Maine State Police to prepare applications for search and arrest warrants. However, to ensure a solid legal basis, they needed one final piece: proof of Rowan's recent contact with materials matching those in the bunker. Thus, the surveillance team implemented the final step: covert sampling from Rowan's small truck bed. While he parked in town to buy groceries, a technician discreetly approached and used forensic tape to collect dust adhering under the truck bed. Material analysis revealed presence of iron oxide and high-carbon alloy, exactly the type in the bunker steel. Several soil samples also matched bunker soil in mica and ilmenite content. With this final piece, the investigation team officially met legal thresholds to request an arrest warrant. All data, direct DNA, matching materials, consistent behavior, reasonable residence location, and signs of underground facility access was submitted to the court, along with an affidavit demonstrating risk that the suspect could destroy evidence if not acted upon promptly. By the end of the fourth surveillance week, the search warrant and arrest warrant were signed, marking the moment Rowan's cover, the reclusive man who appeared harmless, was officially broken after 7 years of concealed activity in the coastal forest region of Mount Desert Island. As soon as the search warrant and arrest warrant were approved, Maine State Police coordinated with U.S. Marshals to deploy the arrest plan for Gareth Rowan, following federal protocol for suspects likely to destroy evidence or flee into mountainous forest terrain. Early the next morning, as Rowan left his cabin with a backpack and mechanical tools, as was his daily routine, the tactical team emerged from 2 directions, blocked his path, and handcuffed him within seconds. Rowan appeared stunned but did not resist, repeatedly asking what's going on while being cuffed and escorted to the special operations vehicle. The cabin and surrounding property were immediately secured for the search. At the investigation station in Bangor, formal interrogation began with 2 investigators and 1 behavioral analyst present. In interview 1, Rowan denied all allegations, insisting he knew nothing about the Seal Cove bunker, had never been there, and was in no way connected to the missing students. He stated that the steel materials and chains were purchased for cabin repairs and small projects he refused to describe in detail. When asked about his forest trips, Rowan replied that he only went hunting or looking for deadwood. These statements were recorded but did not satisfy the investigators' requirements, as they lacked verifiable specifics. The interview ended without major progress, however. The behavioral analysis team noted Rowan's avoidance when questioned about the 2013-2015 period, which coincided with bunker repair activity. In interview 2, police presented forensic evidence. Rowan's DNA matched skin cells found in the bunker, soil samples from under his truck, matched Seal Cove, and purchase records aligned with materials used in the bunker. At this point, internal inconsistencies began to emerge in Rowan. He admitted to purchasing steel but denied using it in any underground structure. He also denied ever owning SF-12B hinges, despite purchase records bearing his signature. When questioned about the soil sample, Rowan changed his story, claiming his truck might have passed through Seal Cove accidentally, despite previously insisting he had never been there. Investigators noted this sudden shift as a material inconsistency, indicating Rowan was attempting to construct a defense narrative but lacked consistency. Throughout the interview, the behavioral specialist observed Rowan's nonverbal cues. He maintained good eye contact when denying unrelated details, but completely avoided eye contact when asked about underground steel structures. When investigators mentioned the old ventilation fan in the bunker, Rowan showed a micro-reaction, slight head tilt, and increased breathing rate, a sign that the topic touched a genuine memory. According to the analysis, these micro-reactions were inconsistent with someone entirely innocent. The nonverbal expert also noted Rowan's tendency to shift seating position when Marcus or Elena were mentioned. This mild discomfort suggested the two names were not as unfamiliar to him as he claimed. The pivotal moment of the interview came during the technical capability assessment. When asked about his mechanical experience, Rowan inadvertently admitted to working with corrosion-resistant steel in boat repair projects at Bass Harbor, the exact type of steel used for the bunker walls. Additionally, when pressed about the SF-12B hinges, Rowan initially denied ownership, but then described how to install that specific hinge type, a detail only someone who had used them would know. Rowan's knowledge of the materials and underground structure became a key factor, as it completely undermined his attempt to portray himself as a reclusive man incapable of building a bunker. After analyzing the full set of statements, the investigative team observed that Rowan frequently employed a blanket denial tactic, repeating "I don't know" or "I wasn't there" without factual basis, but whenever specific evidence was presented, he adjusted his story to fit, inadvertently revealing a greater scope of knowledge than an innocent person should possess. These internal contradictions, combined with nonverbal reactions, created a logical trap that severely undermined the credibility of Rowan's statements. At the conclusion of Interview 2, the investigative team compiled a unified assessment report. Rowan not only had access to the bunker, but also possessed the technical capability to build, maintain, and operate it. His statements contained numerous inconsistencies, and his physical reactions indicated he was withholding information related to both Marcus and Elena. These conclusions became a critical basis for advancing the case to the next stage of legal proceedings, as they demonstrated that Rowan not only had the opportunity, but also the ability to have been directly involved in holding the victims for 7 years. Immediately after Rowan's arrest and transfer for questioning, the field search team proceeded with the court-authorized next steps, focusing on his main cabin and the entire surrounding area spanning more than 3 acres. The cabin was constructed of old timber with thick walls and curtain-covered windows. The interior was cluttered, but contained almost no personal items belonging to anyone other than Rowan. However, during a thorough check of the bedroom, forensics discovered a locked drawer in a wooden cabinet. The mechanical lock was old but intact. After opening it with specialized tools, they found a set of faded-edge paper maps, most marked in pencil around the Seal Cove forest areas, including 3 points matching locations previously flagged by the GPR team. One map was an old photocopy of a 1970s technical piping diagram, a document accessible only to those with prior industrial maintenance experience. This further reinforced that Rowan not only knew about the underground structure, but had tracked, used, and marked it over many years. In addition to the maps, the team recovered a small tin box containing miscellaneous items: hair ties, a fish-shaped keychain, a foreign coin, and a faded light blue fabric bracelet. When taken to the lab, the bracelet was compared to family photos provided by Elena's parents in the 2016 cold case file. It matched exactly the bracelet Elena always wore on her left wrist, a gift from her mother before coming to the U.S. This was the first piece of personal evidence directly linking Elena to Rowan beyond the bunker. While forensics searched the main cabin, another team swept the outbuildings around the property. About 200 meters northeast of the cabin, they discovered a small auxiliary structure, a low wooden shed with weathered gray siding, but the surrounding ground showed unusual compaction, indicating prolonged use. The shed door was secured with a homemade wooden bar, but could be easily removed. Inside was a single room less than 6 square meters, containing no furniture except a thin, torn mattress in the corner and an old metal bucket. However, the notable detail was on the back wall, where a flashlight beam revealed a reddish-brown streak. A swab sample tested positive for human blood. Rapid analysis indicated female blood. When the sample was sent to the lab for DNA comparison, results confirmed it matched the reference profile from Elena Morell's parents. This was the first evidence showing Elena had been present in Rowan's auxiliary shed and may have been injured or held there during a period separate from the Seal Cove bunker. Continuing the search of the wooden shed, investigators found several inconsistent traces, fresh scrape marks on one wall edge, as if from heavy friction. Under the floorboards, nylon fibers matching the type of restraint rope used in the bunker, and a deep impression in one corner of the floor, consistent with a heavy object or anchor hook having been placed there. All these details indicated the auxiliary shed was not a temporary shelter for Rowan, but a secondary holding location. The existence of two holding sites prompted the team to consider that Elena and Marcus may have been moved multiple times depending on the perpetrator's purposes or control tactics. When combining Marcus's DNA, Elena's DNA, and evidence collected from both the bunker and auxiliary cabin, the analysis team constructed a clearer model. Elena was not only held at the Seal Cove bunker, but also at the cabin during a specific period, possibly before Marcus was brought to the bunker, or during a time when the victims were separated. This also explained why Elena's DNA traces in the bunker were fewer than Marcus's, and how Rowan could maintain two separate holding locations undetected for years. The discovery of Elena's bracelet in Rowan's main living cabin was a significant factor. It proved he kept victims' personal items, a behavior typical of control, keepsake, perpetrators aiming to maintain psychological dominance. Beyond the cabin and bunker, the team examined the rear area where Rowan regularly burned trash. There they found partially burned fabric scraps, a lightweight metal zipper portion, and a thick plastic fragment with an unusual pattern. After comparison with Elena's listed belongings, the plastic piece was identified as part of the fixed hairpiece in a hood Elena wore during a school performance, an item she carried in her travel backpack. Though indirect, it further confirmed that Elena's personal belongings had passed through Rowan's hands. The zipper size matched the light jacket Elena wore on the day she disappeared, though heavy charring prevented deeper analysis. With two locations showing female DNA traces along with Elena's personal items found in Rowan's main cabin, the investigative team concluded that the perpetrator did not hold victims in one fixed location, but moved Elena between sites for various purposes, possibly to avoid detection, separate victims, or cycle use of spaces. The final search phase report concluded Elena Morell was present at both the Seal Cove bunker and Gareth Rowan's auxiliary cabin. Personal items and female blood samples matching Elena's DNA prove she was held for a significant period and likely moved multiple times throughout her disappearance. This finding reinforced the entire investigative hypothesis that the case was not a single holding incident, but a multi-site rotating confinement system controlled by one individual with a high degree of calculation. The trial of Gareth Rowan opened at the federal courthouse in Bangor under tight security, with a special prosecution request to present the full chain of evidence in linear sequence to avoid overwhelming the jury. The prosecution began with the core focus, the Seal Cove bunker, where forensic experts presented 3 diagrams describing the deep underground steel structure, restraint points, wear marks on anchor bars, collected skin cells and hair, all tracing back to the 2 victims and one unrelated DNA profile, Rowan's. Next, the DNA analysis team presented the identification process, comparison of samples from the bunker, auxiliary cabin, and Rowan's main cabin, full matches between bunker samples and those from Rowan's discarded trash during surveillance, and confirmation that all testing margins of error were below acceptable thresholds for individual identification. Moving to construction materials, an industrial metals expert analyzed the load-bearing steel hinges, specialized chains, and anchor bolts used in the bunker, proving they were sold at only 2 stores statewide during 2012-2014, and that one matching invoice corresponded to a payment card in Rowan's name. A geobiology expert presented a correlation matrix between soil from Marcus's clothing and soil around Seal Cove, highlighting 5 rare matching points: tremolite minerals, bog-edge forest fungal spore ratios, low-level saltwater traces from sea mist, trace decomposed spruce wood fibers, and distinctive North Bubble Marsh microbial signatures, confirming Marcus had been held within a 1.5 kilometers radius of the bunker location. A criminal psychologist then analyzed Rowan's behavioral pattern: extreme isolation, no medical or social records, minor prior property trespass offenses, and a high likelihood of belonging to the confinement offender group, using enclosed structures, perfectly matching the 7-year timeline constructed by the prosecution from wear patterns, material degradation, and cumulative injuries on Marcus's body. The prosecution presented this timeline as the backbone of the case: initial capture at Ocean Path, transport to Seal Cove in a small truck, inferred from faint industrial rubber scuff marks on bunker metal bars, prolonged fixed confinement, movement between bunker and auxiliary cabin, reduced nutritional intake in later years. And finally, the point at which Marcus was released or abandoned near Ellsworth, consistent with his condition upon discovery. When shifting to behavioral evidence, the prosecution introduced covert surveillance data: Rowan entering the forest at recurring times carrying tools and water containers, behavior consistent with maintaining an underground facility, and presented video clips showing his consistent avoidance of social contact and habit of scanning forest entrances before leaving home. The jury was given a closed perspective, bunker DNA material behavior timeline, forming a seamless logical chain. The defense countered along 3 main lines, arguing that DNA could result from environmental transfer, that construction materials only proved Rowan purchased hardware and not guilt, and that the auxiliary cabin's Elena DNA could have been cross-contaminated by someone else or wildlife movement. When these arguments were raised, the prosecution recalled the DNA expert to demonstrate Rowan's bunker DNA was in primary contact form, embedded deep in metal grooves, impossible via casual cross-contact, and that victim DNA showed vertical distribution patterns only found in confinement spaces. The defense continued by arguing Marcus remembered nothing, and thus could not confirm Rowan as his captor. The prosecution countered with a neurologist explaining prolonged dissociative amnesia in long-term confinement victims, stressing that lack of memory does not negate physical evidence. The defense's strongest claim was the absence of direct eyewitnesses, but the prosecution introduced the concept of a closed evidentiary chain, a complete chain of evidence that leaves no room for another perpetrator without leaving DNA, materials, or behavioral traces. Ultimately, the jury was instructed to evaluate the case not on emotion, but on the logic of the evidence chain. Rowan possessed maps marking the bunker site, Elena's personal items in his main cabin, DNA of both victims in structures under Rowan's control, matching source construction materials, biological data from Marcus's body consistent with Seal Cove geography, and a 7-year timeline with no contradictions. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury issued a preliminary assessment that the evidence chain converged at a level inexplicable by any other reasonable hypothesis of innocence, and determined that the prosecution had constructed a fully closed system of physical, biological, and behavioral evidence. The sentencing hearing at the Bangor Federal Court took place on the morning of the following Tuesday, with the courtroom packed with reporters, the victim's family, and FBI observers. Based on the jury's conclusion that the chain of physical, biological, and behavioral evidence formed a closed structure that could not be explained by any reasonable hypothesis of innocence, the judge proceeded to pronounce the sentence for Gareth Rowan. The prosecution emphasized that the detention lasting over 7 years, the maintenance of multiple holding sites, Marcus's physical emaciation, and clear evidence of the victim's restricted movement through restraint mechanisms demonstrated systematic cruelty, warranting the maximum penalty under federal law for kidnapping involving transportation across national park boundaries. In the final defense argument, Rowan's attorney reiterated that there was no direct eyewitness to the abduction, no video footage or confession, and no evidence showing Rowan had ever transported the victim using his own vehicle. However, the judge rejected this argument, ruling that federal law does not require direct witnesses when the chain of evidence is strong enough to reconstruct the conduct with high certainty, especially given that Rowan's DNA appeared deep within the bunker structure at locations impossible to result from cross-contamination. After the final arguments, the judge read the first sentence, life imprisonment without parole, for the charge of kidnapping in the first degree, based on aggravating factors including prolonged detention, absolute control, and permanent harm to the victim. The court then imposed an additional 40 years of federal imprisonment for the charges of unlawful imprisonment and aggravated abuse to run consecutively after the life sentence. The sentence was designed to ensure that, under any legal circumstance, Rowan would have no possibility of release for the remainder of his life. In pronouncing the sentence, the judge specifically stressed that the behavior of constructing a secret long-term detention infrastructure, along with the deliberate movement of the victim between multiple locations to evade detection, displayed a level of calculation consistent with the long-term control, coercion offender pattern, and therefore the maximum sentence was necessary to protect the community. When the sentencing phase for Marcus concluded, the prosecution moved to the separate portion concerning Elena Morel. The court confirmed that although evidence from the bunker, cabin, and outbuilding showed Elena had been present at multiple locations under Rowan's control, there was no direct evidence establishing her final status. Blood samples, fabric fibers, and personal items only proved presence and possible detention, but there was no body, no post-mortem DNA data, no indication of whether she was alive or deceased, and no statements from Rowan despite 2 formal rounds of questioning. Therefore, federal law required separating Elena's file into a standalone missing person, suspicious circumstances case, classified as outcome undetermined, and to be investigated independently from the Marcus case. In the closing statement, the prosecution affirmed it would continue to pursue additional criminal liability if any new evidence emerged directly linking Rowan to Elena's disappearance. Immediately afterward, the court issued a long-term preservation order for the entire Rowan property to facilitate future excavation and further review. When the sentence was fully read, Marcus's family embraced and wept openly, while the spectator benches behind remained in tense silence. Rowan showed no strong reaction. He stared straight ahead, displaying no clear emotion, only clenching his fists when the marshals locked the second set of cuffs. A notable detail in the ruling was that the court rejected any requests for mitigation based on a history of isolated living, vague psychological history, or social deprivation factors. The judge stated that evidence of Rowan constructing the bunker with industrial materials, maintaining locking systems, performing cyclical structural repairs, and establishing an outbuilding proved he was capable of operating a complex detention system over an extended period, completely refuting the claim that he was an isolated individual, unaware of full consequences. With Elena's file separated, the FBI and Maine State Police announced that the investigation concerning her would continue as an open-ended case, remaining open until evidence determines her living deceased status or final location. In a post-trial press release, an FBI spokesperson emphasized, "The sentence for Rowan addresses his responsibility for Marcus Liu, but the question of Elena Morel remains unanswered. We regard this case as a long-term priority." As the marshals escorted Rowan out of the courtroom, Elena's family remained seated for a long time, staring intently at the crime scene map still on the defense table, as if trying to find an overlooked detail. And although the legal conclusion for Marcus was closed, Elena's file officially entered an independent investigation phase, no longer bound by Rowan's prosecution timeline, but becoming a large unresolved question hanging between 7 years of disappearance and the scant remaining traces. Less than 2 weeks after Rowan's sentencing concluded, The long-term impact assessment report on Marcus was completed by the interdisciplinary medical psychological team from the Department of Justice and Bangor Psychiatric Hospital. It highlighted that the 7-year detention had caused irreversible damage, reduced bone density, sleep regulation disorder, complex stress disorder, and memory recovery potential below 30% according to predictive models. Experts noted that while Marcus could achieve basic social reintegration, cognitive limitations, particularly in processing enclosed spaces and mechanical sounds, would persist lifelong, requiring the family to modify living environments and limit exposure to low-frequency noise. This report quickly became the basis for Acadia National Park to conduct a comprehensive reevaluation of park safety procedures. The Acadia Board of Management, in coordination with NPS and DHS, acknowledged that prior to the case, the park's monitoring system relied too heavily on manual ranger patrols, with insufficient cameras on major trails like Ocean Path and no capability to detect high-risk behavior. The fact that 2 students vanished in 2016 without cameras capturing their last locations became a critical lesson, leading Acadia to implement a 3-phase security overhaul, increasing camera density at entry-exit choke points, establishing real-time visitor alert systems based on voluntary GPS signals, and building a visitor behavior analysis center to detect anomalous movement patterns. In addition, missing person response protocols were revised, SAR activation time reduced to 45 minutes from report receipt. Last known position established using digital data rather than solely witness statements, and grid search maps standardized for expansion to 10 kilometers within the first 2 hours. Alongside internal reforms, Acadia launched a public communication campaign targeting international visitors, especially exchange students, emphasizing access to emergency support systems, safety maps, and recommendations to always register itineraries before entering the backcountry. The U.S. Immigration Service and universities, including those that hosted Elena and Marcus, also updated international student orientation programs, adding sections on main terrain risks, use of National Park Alert Services, and minimum 2-person group rule in Acadia's coastal areas. U.S. and international media continued to follow the case closely, especially since a victim was found alive after many years, making Acadia the focus of numerous debates on natural tourism safety. International outlets from BBC to NHK and La Nación described the case as proof that seemingly safe areas in national parks can become major risk zones when exploited by a lone individual. As a result, visitor numbers to Acadia dipped slightly in the first 3 months post-trial, but quickly recovered after the park announced a new $18 million long-term security investment, primarily for harsh condition cameras and drone night patrol teams. At the local community level, the case raised awareness of gaps in outdoor activity oversight. Bar Harbor and Ellsworth residents proposed creating a community watch for trails network, volunteer groups, to report signs of unauthorized entry or illegal structures. Maine state legislators even proposed legislation requiring periodic inventories of all underground structures in national forests dating back to the Cold War, after Rowan's bunker was found to partially utilize an abandoned technical site's old foundation. The impact assessment also highlighted global media factors. The case was featured in international seminars on natural tourism governance. Other national parks, such as Yosemite, Zion, and Olympic, proactively reviewed their security systems despite no similar incidents. Meanwhile, exchange student communities in the U.S. and international parents expressed concerns about oversight in self-directed study abroad programs, prompting universities to adjust support procedures and increase off-campus trip monitoring. The societal impact extended deeper. Marcus's story became a symbol of survival after prolonged captivity, cited in victim psychology studies and memory recovery science. Several nonprofit organizations began advocating for new federal standards on handling missing persons situations in national parks, previously unstandardized. For Acadia specifically, the case produced fundamental change, from a park relying on visitor personal responsibility rules. Acadia shifted to an active monitoring, prevention model, aiming to prevent any future long-term disappearances. And while these reforms brought a greater sense of safety to the community, all reports concluded that the psychological impact of the case on the surviving victim, the families of both students, and the park management system would persist for many years. As a reminder that the tranquility of a national park can sometimes mask unseen vulnerabilities. The final report from the treatment team at Bangor Medical Center determined that Marcus requires a minimum 3-year long-term functional rehabilitation program, including neurotherapy to improve memory regeneration, physical therapy to restore muscle strength and balance after years of restricted movement, and stress hormone stabilization therapy to reduce overreactivity to new environments. The family and medical team agreed to place Marcus in a semi-residential recovery program, where patients receive continuous monitoring but retain the right to leave the center according to a schedule to avoid triggering panic responses from overly controlled settings. Meanwhile, Rowan, despite receiving life without parole, maintained absolute silence regarding Elena and refused to answer any questions about her location, timing, or final status. Throughout all mandatory prison psychologist sessions, he repeatedly stated there was nothing to disclose, forcing investigators to treat his silence as a deliberate tactic to withhold information and avoid additional charges. Facing this impasse, the FBI and Maine State Police agreed to launch a new expanded search based entirely on outbuilding data, the location containing more Elena traces than the Seal Cove bunker. The geographic analysis team established a 12 square kilometers expanded grid around the outbuilding, focusing on areas with soil composition matching retrieved mineral samples, especially wind-eroded rocky forest strips, where small concealed structures could exist under vegetation. LiDAR drones were deployed to detect surface anomalies such as subsidence depressions or repeated soil compaction patterns, while long-term missing persons K-9 teams were redeployed for their ability to distinguish residual scents in enclosed structures. By the end of the third search wave, a new discovery emerged in a rock crevice approximately 800 meters southwest of the outbuilding. The forensic team recovered a biological sample consisting of 3 keratin fibers, about 7 centimeters long, caught beneath a dislodged slab. Preliminary analysis identified them as female human hair, not matching Marcus, with an 87% match to Elena's genetic profile based on intact marker regions, though the sample showed mild degradation from the humid environment. Nearby, the team also noted a fragment of light gray synthetic fabric with a weave structure similar to the trekking pants Elena wore on the day she vanished. While not sufficient to determine her final location, these 2 traces opened a new investigative avenue, the possibility that Elena was moved out of the outbuilding at an undetermined time, heading southwest, and may have been in a third structure or transported through rocky forest terrain. An internal FBI report stated that with the new traces found at a reasonable distance from the outbuilding, the Elena case would continue indefinitely, moving into stratigraphic investigation and micro-excavation phases at suspected points. At the same time, Marcus was informed of the new discovery as part of a controlled psychological support protocol. According to expert assessment, he responded without breakdown and maintained focus, though he still could not recall any details about Elena during his captivity years. Elena's family, after the trial, continued weekly contact with investigators and participated in prioritizing search areas based on their knowledge of their daughter's behavior. They affirmed they would pursue the case until an official answer emerged, regardless of Rowan's hopeless responses. Internal summaries outlined the current status in 3 key points. First, Marcus's recovery is progressing positively, but will require many years to reach stability. Second, Rowan remains uncooperative, and the likelihood of breaking his silence is very low. Third, Elena's case remains classified as an active open investigation due to new biological traces and cannot be closed. This means the entire file cannot be considered concluded, but continues to expand with each geographic tracing wave. Finally, a joint statement from the FBI, NPS, and Maine State Police affirmed the sentence for Gareth Rowan has addressed legal responsibility for the surviving victim, but the Elena Morel file remains active. New discoveries indicate traces worth pursuing, and the case will continue until objective truth is determined. The case entered a new phase, one part closed, one part still expanding, where every small trace could become the pivotal key to the unresolved answer. The story of the two exchange students who vanished at Acadia and Marcus Liu's 7-year secret captivity serves as a reminder that even the spaces considered safest and most familiar in the United States, such as national parks, can harbor unpredictable risks if monitoring, forecasting, and emergency response systems are not fully prepared. Marcus being found in an emaciated state, bearing signs of long-term restricted movement, along with Gareth Rowan's underground bunker, existing undetected for years in the Seal Cove forest, reflects existing gaps in outdoor safety management. Moreover, the fact that Elena was moved through multiple locations, bunker, outbuilding, and possibly a third site, shows how the perpetrator exploited remoteness, complex terrain, and many visitors' absolute trust in natural spaces. In contemporary American life, as outdoor activities, hiking, and national park tourism grow increasingly popular, this story delivers a powerful reminder that individuals cannot rely entirely on systems and must proactively build safe habits. Always share itineraries with family or school. Enable GPS location when entering the backcountry. Avoid solo travel in low-traffic areas, and thoroughly learn each park's emergency reporting procedures. At the same time, the story underscores the need for public security reform. Acadia has increased camera density, shortened search activation times, and adopted drone patrols, steps that other U.S. national parks can fully adopt. Finally, the unified response of the Maine community, the tireless efforts of investigative forces, and the recovery program for Marcus demonstrate the power of persistence and interagency coordination, an important lesson in a vast society where individual safety and community responsibility are always closely linked. Thank you for following this haunting yet inspiring story of survival. If you'd like to continue joining journeys in search of truth like those of Marcus and Elena, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. See you in the next journey, where we continue exploring unsolved cases and important safety lessons for modern life.